They said the earth refused to take her. Not the villagers, they knew better than to speak of her at all. But the old women, the midwives, and gravediggers, the ones with gray at their temples and crow-feathered rosaries around their wrists, they whispered that phrase when the wind howled strangely through the cypress trees. The earth refused to take her. No nursemaid stayed longer than a week. Cats hissed at her door. Birds circled her chimney. But Alina grew, quiet, unblinking, with a mind like frost and a tongue like a locked cabinet. Half the town perished in 3 weeks. The priest rang the bells until his fingers bled, and still the death carts rolled day after day. Alina watched but did not weep. Always. She walked barefoot through the graves, tracing the names with her fingers, humming softly. They blamed her. When a widow lost her son to a fall, she blamed Alinar's shadow. One man swore he saw her walking in the cemetery at night, whispering to the soil. Another claimed she sold her tears to gypsies, though no one had ever seen her cry. Fear clung to her like fog. When the fever finally passed, people said she hadn't been touched. Not a cough, not a tremble. They called it grace, but they did not mean it kindly. Her father, a stonecutter, never remarried. He spoke to her as if she were already gone. In many ways she was. The next. Led by the priest and the blacksmith with rage twisting his face, Alinar did not run. She stood barefoot in the snow, her eyes still, her lips closed. She did not scream when they dragged her. She did not fight when they bound her. But she spoke once, as they tied her to the cart. Gone. She's in the well by the east wall, sleeping. The village scoured the woods for days. The river was dragged, the wells were checked, no blood. Unharmed, but curled in a trance, as if caught in a dream too deep to escape. She woke the moment they touched her, coughing, shivering, eyes wild. No cloth, no bones, just absence, cold and echoing. He invited her to help gather roots in the forest. She did, quietly, diligently, with a strange knack for finding the right herb in the darkest patch of earth. Over time, he taught her to read, to measure tinctures, to recognize the difference between sleep and death. It's not the breath, he once whispered to her, grinding poppy seed into powder. It's the eyes. If the soul is still home, the eyes look back. Her name was Alinar, born beneath a bleeding moon in the village of Valembruz, where mist rarely lifted and the river ran black with tannin. She was not beautiful in the usual sense. Her eyes were too dark, her skin too pale. But there was something about her silence, a calm that made people uneasy, like watching still water and knowing something monstrous swam beneath it. They said she was cursed from birth, that her mother died screaming in a pool of blood, and after that, the cradle never stopped rocking even when empty. When Alina was 13, the fever came. It moved through the village like a shadow. No cough, no boils, just cold limbs and sudden silence. The local apothecary, a lean man with spectacles like coins and hands that always smelled of sage, took notice. She listened. But the villagers watched. When sheep miscarried, then came the night the child went missing. Only 5 years old, the blacksmith's youngest daughter, with a ribbon always in her hair. One moment she was playing by the orchard, and so the whispers became words. Then the words became torches. They came for her at dawn. 30 men, grim and breathless. The girl is not dead, she said softly. And then nothing. They found her exactly where Alinar said. But instead of awe, the villagers saw only more fear, because how could Alinar have known? They found her in the apothecary's attic, curled beneath an old velvet tapestry that once hung behind the altar before the fire. Her eyes were open, but she did not scream. She did not flee. She merely blinked, as if woken from a dream too heavy to shake. The villagers stood around her in a jagged circle as though she were an altar in the wrong place at the wrong time. None moved. The butcher's wife crossed herself, but the others just watched, as if waiting for her to speak a sentence that would end them all. When she finally stood, it was as if a weight shifted in the beams of the house itself. One of the young men dropped his torch. It landed on the floor, and no one moved to stamp it out. She bled onto the frost, and where her blood fell, the snow did not melt, it steamed. An old woman whispered that this meant she decrossed the threshold, that her soul no longer belonged to the world of the living, nor the dead. Bread soured overnight, milk curdled before it was poured. Birds did not return in spring. Cattle birthed stillborn calves. The church bell rang at random hours, even though no one touched the rope. Still, in the ash, they found two things untouched: a bundle of dried herbs tied with red twine, and the candle from her coffin fully intact. And the wind it carried a voice none could understand, but all feared. A voice that sounded like hers, and yet not. Like it had come from beneath the earth, pulled up through centuries of silence. But the hollow vigil had worked, yes, but had brought something else back with her. One man walked east for 3 days and returned to his doorstep at dawn, covered in pine needles, his eyes bloodshot, his tongue gone. Others vanished outright, their homes found with food still warm, doors wide open. And the wind never stopped. A place where wolves howled in winter, and nothing grew but moss and fog. They tied her to the stake at midnight, but when they lit the fire, it refused to catch. The wood hissed, the flames guttered and died. They tried again and again. They poured oil, they whispered prayers, but the pyre would not burn. And Alina stood silent, her hair catching starlight, her gaze fixed not on them but beyond, to something no one else could see. Doors flew open, chimneys howled, animals screamed. And somewhere in the woods, someone or something sung. A lullaby, slow, in a tongue no one remembered, but all felt in their bones. She looked at them each one, and something ancient stirred behind her eyes. Not vengeance, not hatred. Something worse, understanding. She did not beg, she did not speak. And that terrified them more than any spell or curse. They dragged her back through the woods, barefoot in the snow, ropes at her wrists. This time, there was no coffin, only fire. In his sleep, he saw her walking through the nave of the ruined chapel, barefoot and trailing roots from her fingers. She reached for the cross, and it cracked. He awoke screaming. His heart stopped 2 nights later. The baker's child saw her in the well, eyes wide in the water, mouth open but never breathing. He fell ill the next day, and within a week, he was gone. The blacksmith's wife swore she heard Alina whispering through the fireplace, calling her name not with malice but with sadness. She walked into the woods one morning and was never found. They built the pyre at the village's edge. That was when the dreams began. The first came to the priest, though he had not joined the burning. The village began to rot slowly from the inside. Some tried to leave, but the road twisted. The forest moved. The apothecary's house burned down on the 13th night after the second trial. No one claimed to set the fire, but no one mourned its loss. The remaining villagers spoke little, worked less, and slept poorly. The tavern closed. The chapel decayed. Children stopped being born. Then came the 30th night. A storm, rose-black, unnatural, full of thunder with no lightning, wind with no rain. And from that moment, she was no longer a girl who had been buried alive. She was a memory the land could not forget. She was the breath in the frost, the ache in the marrow, the whisper in the trees. Alina had become the curse she had never cast. Years passed. Seasons bled into one another like bruises across the land. The village had no name anymore, at least not one spoken aloud. Maps forgot it. Travelers avoided it. Trees leaned in closer with every year, branches growing thicker, heavier, as if nature itself was trying to smother a shame it could no longer bear. The people who remained walked with heads bowed and mouths shut. that if you stayed too long in the woods after dusk, you'd see a figure tall, cloaked in wind, barefoot and weightless moving between the trees, not walking, not floating, just existing. Her presence warped the air around her, like a fire glimpsed through smoke. They heard the stories, half-muttered in broken ends by drunk men too tired to lie. Some came with offerings, candles, coins, apologies. Others came with tools, hoping to disprove what they called the myth of the buried girl. None returned with answers. A few never returned at all. One left behind a journal, its last page stained with tears and wax. It read only, "She wept when I touched the ground. The earth remembers her pain." The birds fell silent. The insects stilled. And you would feel something deep inside you, remember something ancient, buried, and wrong. Cartographers marked it only with a blank space. Those who entered reported odd phenomena: flowers blooming in winter, blood in the snow, the scent of lavender on the wind. Mothers told their daughters not to mock the forest. Fathers warned their sons to never speak ill of the dead. Leaner became more than a name. She became a lesson, legend, a question carved into the bones of a nation. What happens when we bury the truth alive? Some claimed to hear a girl humming just beyond sight. Others dreamed of drowning in a coffin made of roots and salt. They never spoke of her, never uttered her name, but they never left either. Something kept them there, some tether not of iron or rope, but of guilt, of fear, of quiet reverence for what they had done and what it had unleashed. Children born in later years, though rare, were taught not to sing, not to stare at reflections, not to dig too deep. The old woman who kept the last candle said that Alina had been neither witch nor saint, but something older, something the earth itself had remembered when humans had forgotten. That her burial was not a punishment, but a ritual, not to silence her, but to awaken her. If the wind begins to hum a lullaby you recognize or remember, not every grave stays closed. Not every death is the end. It's not every girl who is buried alive is ever meant to die. Some to illness, some to accidents. One drowned himself in the frozen lake, a rosary tied to his wrist. Another was found muttering apologies to the shadows on his wall, his eyes milky and rolled back. That vengeance was not always loud. It was patient. That grief, when buried alive, does not die. It waits. It roots. And one day it rises. The apothecary's family vanished in a single night. The only thing left in their home was a single note carved into the stone hearth. "She walks when we sleep." And awaken her they had. The men who lit the fire were all gone now. Steed. They said she came not to kill, but to remind. That suffering had a shape, and it wore her face. Pilgrims came eventually not out of courage, but curiosity. The land around the village became known as Hollowfield, and the story, it never left. It passed from lips to ears across taverns, across ages. She was not a witch. She was not a prophet. She was not a monster. She was the price of silence. And silence, once broken, never returns to sleep. So if one day you find yourself near the old woods, if the air grows colder without cause, if your breath forms strange shapes in the dark, because some stories do not rest, they wait.